Okay, I'm so thankful to have received the award. I'm really honored, and I want to thank the anonymous reviewer and as well Roy and Christos, because they bared with me through numerous emails of me trying to check things and make sure I got everything in order. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to have won the award and to present this paper to you today. The paper is what I'm calling a Frankenstein paper because it's been rewritten many times in all sorts of different versions. What I'm showing you today is very similar to the one I submitted to the David Ritchie's medal, but it's the actual chapter that will be in my thesis. And I was working on it last week to try and improve it and tweak it a bit. So I'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts on it during the Q&A. I'm also really excited to say that a version of this Frankenstein paper has also been accepted in the Energy Research and Social Science Journal. And it's in print at the moment and should be coming out any day now. So if there's anything that you thought was interesting about today's talk, maybe you'd like to check out the paper, or if there was anything unclear, you can read it in the printed paper as well. But because this is what I'm presenting today is a thesis chapter, I had to take out some of the contextual parts. There'll be in other, in the introduction and in parts of other chapters. So I'd like to start by giving you just a very brief overview of some of the concepts that I'm using and just to explain what my fieldwork is about. My research is on what I'm calling energy elites. So these are leaders and experts in the energy industry, particularly in Norway, because that's where I did my fieldwork from September 2018 until February 2020. I was based in Oslo, Norway. My field site pretty much looked like this picture. I was based at two energy companies. Both of those energy companies were producing hydrocarbons, oil and gas, as well as renewable energy, particularly wind and solar energy. And I'm keeping everyone and all the locations and all the companies anonymous. And this is why I'm showing you this general landscape picture. I spent some of this time in this particular place. This was the financial district of Oslo, but also further down the Oslo fjord, there was a lot of industry related companies and buildings. So I sort of went in and out of those companies. Even though I had two host companies, they then connected me to people from other places so that I would go and speak to people from various energy related companies, both consulting and also energy production companies and finance companies. Just briefly, I have this diagram here. It comes up in the paper, and I don't want to go into much detail, but this is something we can discuss later. This is just an overview of what professions my interlocutors had, because this is sort of a central theme in this paper. I'm looking at people who worked in oil and gas and then switched out of it to pursue a career in renewables. Because I'm keeping everyone anonymous, I have pictures of myself that I can show you, but not of the other people that I work with. Not all I did was hang out in these corporate office spaces. I had the chance to do a lot of outdoorsy things with my interlocutors, from skiing and ice skating to kayaking and sailing and even hunting. So that was a chance for me to understand how my interlocutors were situated beyond their professional lives. And then I also spoke to people who were not in leadership and expert positions. So differently positioned employees throughout the companies, but also people outside of the companies. I spoke to some biologists and climate scientists, as well as diplomats and politicians and some bureaucrats, just to get a sort of wider perspective of these energy elites, as I'm calling them, and how that all interrelates on the themes that I was looking at, which is energy transitions and climate change. Just briefly with energy transitions, that used to be a part that was in this paper, but is now in a different chapter. Again, something that I'd happily discuss in the Q&A. But for me, I'm looking at energy transitions as a sort of liminal process where different kinds of energy coexist and conflict in a sometimes almost paradoxical way. And I don't see them as clear, going from A to point B, linear trajectories. Yeah, I'm sort of trying to make the overall argument that transitions can be, especially energy transitions, can be perpetuated in a way where there's no clear end goal and where the transition itself has become the end. This particular paper is about, as I said, people who left the oil industry and moved into renewables. And even though that happened before I started my fieldwork, and it continues to happen after, the time period, especially in 2019 and the beginning of 2020, a lot of particularly highly positioned people in the upper echelons of the industry decided to switch careers. And this was noticed also by the media. And this is one of the biggest articles that created a lot of talk in the industry and outside of it, because it details for industry professionals and their reasons for leaving oil. That's something I'll discuss in the paper. And just to give you a little bit of context, this was a time where a lot of changes were perceived by my interlocutors. On the one hand, there was increasing climate change concern. This middle picture here, I actually took myself. It's taken from Svalbard, better known as Spitsbergen, which is an island at the very top of Norway. It's already in the Arctic, and it's a glacier melting. And then there were school strikes, something also I will discuss in the paper, and a lot of changes in the industry itself. Just to show you this picture, because I will mention it also in the paper, this girl was protesting for the climate, inspired, by the Greta Thunberg protests. And she was out there with a placard on a Friday, and it says, Oljefanten I rummet, which means oil elephant in the room. And that's a subtitle in the paper. So I just want to show you this. But I think I have one more thing that I noted that I wanted to, oh yeah, right, energy elites. This is the elephant in the room of this presentation. I have a whole chapter of this in my thesis, and I'm actually currently working on it. It's also part of the original paper, but I won't discuss the definition and my conceptualization today in detail. But again, I'm happy to do so during the Q&A. Just to briefly give you an idea of what I mean by the terms, I use it as a way to highlight shared modes of life amongst my interlocutors, particularly a shared socioeconomic status. And so I move away from the traditional focus in the elite literature on power, and I try to see my interlocutors more as mediating rather than autonomous agents. So I see them as as part of a larger decision-making system, and not as all-powerful leaders, as they are sometimes described. So I'm starting off with a vignette. Everyone should ask him or herself regularly when looking in the mirror in the morning, from society's perspective, what problem are you solving? This is a quote by Rolf, because Rolf and I had been talking for the better half of an hour. He was a high-level manager at Petro Solutions, a large multinational oil service company with a base in Norway. Rolf had grown increasingly frustrated with his own involvement in the fossil fuel sector. During our regular meetings in his office, he often shared with me his reflections on climate change, energy transitions, and on his own position in the energy industry. On this particular afternoon, we met over coffee, when mid-conversation, Rolf started recounting his daily dialogue in front of the bathroom mirror, as he himself referred to it. Rolf had propped himself up on his chair, cleared his throat, and then continued by rhetorically asking out loud, "What problem am I solving?" In response to his own question, he exclaimed, "I'm actually creating a problem." Now turning towards me, Rolf mimicked standing in front of his bathroom mirror and continued reenacting the reflexive dialogue with himself. I can say what I am solving. I'm developing this nation, the welfare of this nation, secure income, making sure that we have a solid welfare. I'm contributing that we make money that can give everyone a good life. I can say that, of course. Then the follow-up question is, couldn't you do that with your skills? Couldn't you do that without the side effect of pollution? Yes, I could. Then why aren't you doing it? Because I'm a coward. Turning towards me with a slightly uncomfortable smile on his face, Rolf questioningly said, I'm sure I'm not the only one who has these kinds of conversations in the bathroom. This is the end of the vignette. Throughout my fieldwork, many interlocutors shared with me personal reflections on their own positionality in the fossil fuel sector. As noted by Rolf in the excerpt above, many justified their oil and gas professions by arguing that their work provided Norway with national socioeconomic welfare. Increasingly, however, and similarly to Rolf, a significant number of my interlocutors no longer wanted to work for an energy sector they associated with causing climate change and impeding energy transitions. This chapter examines the career changes energy elites made in response to their own reflections, their social networks, industry changes, and the wider socioeconomic context in Norway throughout 2018 to 2020. Amongst technological, economic, environmental, and political reorientations, I demonstrate in this chapter that changes in perceptions are at the heart of energy transitions. To understand the complex interrelationships between these factors requires attention to how people envision and become part of shifts in energy trajectories. With many studies focused on how energy production or the absence thereof affects people in different and often unequal ways, this chapter instead asks how people shape energy futures. To answer this, I analyze how the leaders and experts of energy companies come to promote energy transitions in Norway. I suggest that essential to the structural shifts towards low carbon energy futures are transitions of energy elites, changes in perceptions followed by professional reorientations of strategically situated industry actors. I show that leaders and experts, who I'm referring to as energy elites, are instrumental not only in publicly promoting low carbon renewable energy production, but also in providing opportunities for other industry professionals to become part of energy transitions in Norway. Energy envisions may entail fantastic futures and grand future utopias, I'm quoting Sovokul, but they may also form part of a more short-term strategic and personal choice of how people position themselves at times of perceived changes. It is people's personal motivations that will be analyzed here to show that as energy elites invest into their own energy futures, they simultaneously advance energy transitions at large. I will examine how oil industry leaders and experts in Norway became the promoters of low carbon energy production from 2018 to 2020. This chapter recognizes that a multitude of actors and developments contribute to energy transitions. Therefore, energy elites are analyzed here as strategically situated promoters, not sole leaders of low carbon energy transitions. Examining how they navigate these transition contexts is instructive for how leaders and experts more generally may face predicaments in other energy and societal transitions. Considering the urgency of climate change and the responsibility and power attributed to corporate actors, it is essential to examine how energy elites impact energy trajectories. Yet the literature on energy leaders and experts remains scarce. I note some exceptions here, also Sean's work and Meta's work. Work that examines how strategically situated people may shape energy transitions is even sparser. This concerns particularly qualitative research that takes its starting point in leaders and experts' own perceptions. This chapter highlights the importance of understanding individuals' relations to structural changes. It provides an empirically attuned, person-centered perspective on energy transitions that shows how shifts towards renewable energy futures are promoted by reflexive, strategically situated people. This next part I'm going to summarize. So the professionals that left the oil industry in Norway became known as oljeavhoppere, oil leavers, and I will discuss this a little bit further down again, the terminology. Out of a total of 109 of my interlocutors, 30% left oil. And most of them switched into equivalent position in the renewables sector, but nevertheless, it was a sort of decisive break from their oil-intensive professions and indicated to wider publics, but also to others in the industry, a shift, which was concurrent with other shifts that were happening at the same time, because it seemed that they turned their backs on decades of oil production, which was associated with high income jobs and welfare for the country. So I also have to say that, I think I said that before actually, that oil leaving happened before I came to the field and it continued happening after, but there was something specifically heightened and amplified in this time because so much media and industry attention was on this oil leaving. So from this, I jump into the theory. There's a tendency in the social science literature to depict elites as resistant and resisting to changes and as adamant on protecting the status quo. And here I summarize again, because I have this literature review where I include people like Vilfredo Pareto's work, Pierre Bourdieu, and Abner Cohen, and I cite the ways that they depict elites as resisting those changes and what kinds of methods they have, such as distinction through cultural capital and symbolic capital in the case of Bourdieu, or Abner Cohen speaks about elites forming these exclusive circles that distinguish them from wider society. In this vein, Georg Simmel noted that I quote, "The highest classes, as everyone knows, are the most conservative. No change can bring them additional power, and every change can give them something to fear, but nothing to hope for." Simmel links elites' alleged conservatism to an ascribed desire to preserve their power and status and positions. Similarly, Tijo Solverda has stressed that elites, especially in the face of change, tend to defend their interests and privileges as a reaction to external challenges to their position. Solverda further distinguishes that in order to maintain the status quo, elites apply power defensively, which he contrasts to subalterns, who, according to him, apply power proactively to challenge a given structure or situation. Contrary to this argument, I show that many energy elites challenge the fossil fuel status quo in Norway, including their own positions in it. Moreover, by promoting energy transitions, they actively pursue changes to the dominant hydrocarbon energy trajectories. In this chapter, I want to disentangle and challenge the prevalent assumption that elites thwart changes in order to preserve their own power positions. Firstly, I contest the notion that elites are solely driven by a desire to preserve their status. Most oil leavers I encountered, as I said, moved into equivalent or slightly higher leadership and expert positions from oil into the renewables sector. And this has been described as a common practice amongst elites. Hubert Schief, for example, said that it often happens that elites go from leading politics to a position in banking and vice versa. In this chapter, I demonstrate, however, that career reorientations for many oil leavers were more than the pursuit of professional and socioeconomic targets. As the ethnographic data will show, leaving oil was also motivated by ethical, environmental, and larger politico-economic aims to promote energy transitions. Secondly, and by extension of this first point, I demonstrate that in the case of elites, personal changes deeply interrelate with societal transformations. On the one hand, energy elites' social networks, changes in the energy industry, and increasingly vocal public climate change concerns contributed to my interlocutors' decisions to leave oil. On the other hand, the personal career reorientations of energy elites had wider societal ramifications. Whether purposefully or not, oil-leaving energy elites signaled to other industry professionals and publics that leaders and experts discouraged the continuation of the oil status quo and instead promoted low-carbon energy futures. Thirdly, I show that it is precisely their strategic positions that situate elites as ideal promoters of societal changes. I suggest that energy elites' socioeconomic background enables their career reorientations into renewables. Oil leavers moved into renewables because they were able to and because they deemed it desirable. This particular career mobility, in turn, allowed oil-leaving energy elites to exemplify successful energy transitions and to promote a sacrifice-free notion of renewable energy futures where continued socioeconomic well-being would be ensured. Finally, I'd like to draw attention to the multiple scales and characteristics of changes. When scholars argue that elites insist on the status quo, they largely remain vague as to the nature of the changes that elites supposedly resist. What they analyze as impediments to changes, social reproduction, exclusive processes of mystique, as Bourdieu and Cohen, that may be better understood, I suggest, as a continuity within change. But the changes detailed in this chapter are as much of a continuation of the status quo as they present a rupture from the dominant hydrocarbon trajectories. While in most instances oil leaving allowed energy elites to preserve their professional status, it involved significant changes in perceptions in which increasingly renewable energy was seen as favorable to hydrocarbon production. These revaluations of energy, I argue, are at the root of larger changes in the energy industry. And then I go on to quote Marshall Sahlins and his continuity within change, but also how he allows for ruptures and discontinuities. I won't go into detail here, but I'll continue in the next paragraph. It is important to emphasize that oil leaving was differently experienced and framed by my interlocutors. For some, it involved a stark personal and professional rupture, similar to the ones that Sahlin has detailed. They moved from understanding oil as an essential part of their and society's socioeconomic welfare to seeing it as a polluting substance with destructive potential to climate and environment. For others, leaving oil was encountered as an opportunity to acquire a new job, higher salary, and work with a different technology, but not really as a drastic break from their previous occupations. As such, there is not one change that Norwegian energy elites either resisted or embraced, but a multitude of continuous and discontinuous changes, plural, that became part of the liminal processes of energy transitions. Okay, I will give you a little bit of context. This is the next section of this chapter, but I have mentioned some of this already in the presentation, so I might skip over some of it. When I first started my fieldwork in September 2018, my interlocutors widely described the simultaneous promotion of hydrocarbons and renewables in Norway as schizophrenia or a paradox. Despite their acknowledgement of an energy dilemma, and despite the rollout of corporate rebranding and the increasing adoption of low carbon initiatives, the energy elites I encountered in 2018, particularly those who worked in oil, rarely problematized the underlying tensions between the continued reliance on fossil fuels and growing concerns for climate change. Instead, they chose to emphasize the importance of their extractive activities as a source of revenue for the Norwegian welfare state. Actually, I should have said that during my short presentation, but Norway is one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world and in Europe. So this is sort of an important piece of background information to know. And they discovered oil in the late 1960s and then developed it throughout the 70s and 80s, which has created this enormous wealth, which they invested in what they call the Norwegian Welfare Fund, which is supposed to ensure this wealth for future generations. This is sort of crucial information as I continue. But anyway, at the time that I started my fieldwork, it seemed to me too that climate change was an issue about which people cared and had considerable information. Ooh, doggy, but one about which they did not really want to know, and in some cases did not know how to know. This is a quote by Norgard. So the start of my fieldwork really was marked by climate change being a concern that was largely acknowledged by my interlocutors, but really widely avoided as a topic of reflection. But over the course of my research, this changed drastically. By the summer of 2019, climate change concerns had grown significantly in Norway in as well as beyond the energy industry. So as I mentioned, school strikes happened regularly in front of Parliament, and this was inspired by Greta Thunberg. Then flight shame, known in Norwegian as flyskammen, originating from Sweden, started becoming a movement. So people would feel shame for flying and contributing to emissions. And that spilled over to other parts of socio-environmental life, where suddenly people shamed each other for behaviors they didn't think were okay in this sort of new eco-environmental framing. And then also in politics, there were municipal elections, and the Green Party for the first time really sort of gained a lot of traction, with them getting significant seats, particularly in the larger cities. And then, so that was sort of outside of the industry, but also within the industry, particularly in the hydrocarbon sector, a lot of changes happened. So the big oil companies started branching out and remarketing as general mixed energy companies, advocating that they could make their oil clean by using different technologies, like carbon capture and storage, and electrifying their platforms. And at the same time, the investor environment changed. Investors wanted to invest more in green industry rather than oil and gas. So during the second half of my fieldwork, oil and gas businesses repositioned themselves as companies with the skills and technology available to find climate sustainable energy solutions. And that was really a decided shift from earlier, when they expressed pride in providing all this welfare and wealth for the Norwegian state. And these shifts that I'm noticing, they have been, other studies have captured them. There's one by Guri Bang and Bordland. They looked at from 2013 to 2018, and they noted only really slight changes in the marketing and the rhetoric of oil companies. So there was much sort of slower change, which then in 2019, with all of this environment of amplified climate and energy talk, really sort of mushroomed up. So during the period of my fieldwork, perceptions favorable to oil and gas were increasingly drowned out by industry voices advocating for the incorporation of renewable and low carbon technologies into the business portfolios of energy companies. As renewable energy projects and investments expanded throughout 2019 and 20, so did the career moves of energy elites. During this time, oil leaving amongst my interlocutors not only became more frequent, but was amplified by media and industry attention, as I mentioned before. Their career shifts away from hydrocarbons were seen as a reaction to growing climate change concerns, and they encapsulated a heightened sense of change as they rendered visions of renewably produced energy futures increasingly tangible. So I hope that sets the scene a bit, especially now with that crucial information of Norway being this big oil country, petrostate, which will allow me now to go into presenting you with some of my ethnography and analysis of that. Okay. The first case of oil leaving I encountered during my fieldwork was also the most surprising. It was the career move of David, a formerly loyal proponent of the oil and gas sector. He was initially introduced to me in early October 2018 at Energo, which is the energy consultancy company where I spent the first year of my fieldwork. At the time, David occupied an upper management position in business development and had worked in the hydrocarbon sector since he graduated from university. He was in his late 40s-ish, I think. I first encountered David as the person who most vocally expressed his pride in working for the oil and gas sector. Over coffee, he told me, "I have always been very proud of being part of the oil and gas industry. It has built the country, and it's also seen as a high-tech industry where a lot of innovation is driven. The perception of the industry here is very different from what I've seen in other countries, because in Norway, it's considered a special industry. It's a very valuable industry. It's the most important industry in the country. And it's where the best people try to get a job. The smartest and the most hardworking are employed in hydrocarbons. It's very high status. That's why I've always been very proud of working in it." This excerpt captures very well the kind of exceptionalism with which the oil and gas sector was treated by many energy elites when I commenced my research. For them, as for David, working in hydrocarbons was considered a status symbol. It was associated with being smart and hardworking in a sector perceived as highly innovative and viewed as a crucial contributor to Norway's socioeconomic welfare. As our chat continued, David did note the start of a shift in perceptions within and outside of the industry, away from the seemingly unquestioned appreciation of hydrocarbons towards a more critical and sustainability-oriented stance. His reflections at the time were representative of the way other energy elites too dealt with this aforementioned schizophrenia or paradox. On the one hand, interlocutors like David, they were, and I'm quoting Hertzfeld, perpetuating their grasp of the present and future by monumentalizing the past, and that they continued to see the production of oil and gas as a crucial component of energy futures. On the other hand, they dealt with the growing uncertainties of a future which they increasingly saw as unable to sustain life in the way it has done in the past. David concluded our first coffee meeting by saying that, and I quote him, "We are addicted to oil and gas, both in the way it is used and in the value it creates. Even if you would like to get away from fossil fuels, it's hard to because of their physical properties, but also because we are so used to the resource." David emphasized the importance of oil and gas beyond their energy use. He referred to what Jessica Smith describes as the ethics of material provisioning, how hydrocarbon extraction provides the material basis for people's everyday lives around the world. Considering his pride in the fossil fuel sector at the time of our first meeting in 2018, I was very surprised in the next exchange we had, which was in mid-January 2019. We met in passing in the corridors of Energo, where after initial small talk, David smiled and said to me, "This is my last month at Energo. I'm moving to Wilfred Energy. Have you heard of them?" I shook my head because I didn't. And then he said, "They're one of the biggest Norwegian renewable companies. I'm going to start working in renewables." He was really excited about it. I laughed and I replied, "You're going to work in renewables? Wow, that's unexpected." Recalling our meeting a couple of months back where David spoke so proudly of the oil and gas sector, I was intrigued by his decision to move to the renewables sector. We agreed to set a time for a catch-up meeting once he had settled into his new position. When we met again in late March 2019, David seemed really comfortable in his new position, which seemed to be an equivalent but slightly senior position to the one he held previously. And so I asked him what motivated his professional career reorientation, to which he responded, "Of course, the renewables aspect was definitely significant when it came to my career change. I see that the oil and gas sector has a very determined future, and sooner or later it will end. It's just a matter of when that will happen. But that was not my only motivation for seeking another opportunity." David emphasized throughout our follow-up chat that he still thought the oil and gas sector was an important source of value creation for the Norwegian economy. And he underscored that he had not changed his views on hydrocarbons. However, I did notice changes in the way he spoke about the sector. His statement on the inevitable end of fossil fuel production felt decidedly different from his comments a few months prior, when he could hardly imagine a future free from an addiction to hydrocarbons. In this follow-up chat, David also described his experiences working in the renewable sector as being more institutionally supported by government, investors, and authorities compared to working in hydrocarbons. He says, "What I notice is that when working with renewables, you have more tailwind. This is different from when I was working in oil and gas. With renewables, the attitude is more, is there anything we can do for you? It's much more supportive." It seemed that David, since our last encounter, had experienced the energy industry's shifting attention towards renewable and low carbon energy production. He began to view fossil fuels more critically and started to question the extent to which they would feature in energy futures. Increasingly, David seemed to view oil and gas as a sunset industry and consequently positioned himself at the forefront of what he came to understand as the new energy future. So, he never really elaborated with me on what other reasons he had, except for the environmental reason for switching careers. But it seemed to me that it was career and a sort of career strategic motivation to climb the corporate ladder. David was the first one, as I said, who jumped careers from hydrocarbons into renewables, but soon more energy elites followed suit that I knew. An emerging trend that gained so much traction by early 2020 that it was picked up by the Norwegian media. One article in particular, published in the magazine version of Norway's financial newspaper, Dagens Næringsliv, which is the article you saw before, that was a screenshot of it. That article brought significant attention to the exodus of top industry leaders away from oil into renewables. It was forwarded to me by several of my interlocutors, those who themselves went through a career change, as well as those who decided to stay in oil and gas. The article popularized the term oljeavhoppere, which means directly translates to oil off jumpers, or simply to oil leavers, as I adopt in this paper. And from this point onwards, it was widely employed, particularly to describe leaders, but also to describe other industry professionals who left the fossil fuel sector. Out of all the oil leavers that I encountered, most were leaders, but there were a few experts who were in senior advisory, consultant, and engineering positions who also left oil for renewables. And I have to emphasize that that term, oljeavhoppere, was quintessentially connected to people leaving oil for renewables rather than any other non-energy related industry. And that really was a powerful image broadcasted to the public, that energy elites, leaders and experts formerly deeply established in the hydrocarbon sector, a business that for decades had been associated with Norwegian welfare and wealth, reoriented themselves to work for a different, almost opposing branch of the industry. Therefore, I suggest that these career moves were seen as more than simply changing jobs. They portrayed a reorientation of identity and allegiance and showed that leaders and experts increasingly envisioned low carbon energy futures and positioned themselves accordingly. Summarizing bits here again. So this article detailed a very linear trajectory, and it was the four leaders they had in portraits was very much about their sort of moral, ethical awakening of how bad oil was and moving into renewables. That was the kind of message that came across from the article. And really, out of my interlocutors, most listed climate and ethical concerns for their reasons of switching careers, but particularly one of my interlocutors, who I'm referring to here as Malin, that was really the main motivation that she cited as for leaving oil. And she was a successful Norwegian businesswoman who worked in oil for most of her career up to that point. And she was introduced to me by another interlocutor of mine who was also a successful businesswoman in the oil industry. And that friend who had introduced us, she was, when she first told me about Malin's career change, she was really belittling it. And she said, I mean, she's giving up this high paid position for this work in renewables. And she couldn't really understand it. But to Malin, changing jobs was an urgent matter. Working in a sector she understood as directly contributing to climate change was something Malin felt she could no longer ethically justify. In a meeting over after-work drinks, Malin explained to me what changed her outlook, and I quote her. I used to think it was really cool to work in the oil and gas sector, and I was so proud of it. At the time I started 20 years ago, we were not thinking about the environmental effects at all. But what changed my attitude? Well, the protest movements headed by Greta Thunberg, but mostly my children who are aged 17 and 20 and are really engaged in the climate and environment. My children and I worry that we are heading at full speed into something we don't know the effect of. And I share my children's concern for the climate future, and I no longer want to be in a position where I feel responsible for polluting the planet. Instead, I'm trying to save the world, and I know it sounds pompous and I don't have a solution, but at least I'm trying. I'm trying to make a difference with this new job. Malin was the only oil leaver I encountered who accepted a position that was not at an equivalent level of seniority to her previous hydrocarbon job. So she went from a top leadership position in oil to have a junior position in a startup with renewables. Yet her newfound convictions about the importance of becoming an active part of energy transitions and climate mitigation efforts were, as she noted herself, more important to her than preserving her top management status. Malin's professional reorientation was amongst the few which was also accompanied by a change in personal lifestyle choices. She decided to limit her flying, both privately and for work, and chose, together with her family, to adopt a predominantly vegetarian diet. The changes she pursued in her professional and private life, as Malin noted, were deeply influenced by her children and climate action movements. This illustrates the importance of analyzing how elites' social networks and wider socioeconomic and political contexts inform their choices. In Norway, energy elites' decisions to leave oil must be seen in a relation to a social and professional environment that grew increasingly favorable to renewable energy production. The advancement of energy transitions is thus not only an elite matter. While oil leavers further promoted low carbon energy futures in Norway, they did so by engaging with and reacting to growing societal climate change concerns. Yet energy elites' leadership and expert roles, I suggest, imbue them with a public voice that can animate others to pursue low carbon energy solutions. So for example, in Malin's case, that friend that introduced that was sort of belittling in the beginning, she actually later on decided to change some of her own sustainability measures in her oil job. So that sort of had an effect. She felt inspired by Malin. Therefore, elites, I argue, do not only bandwagon pre-existing societal trends, but can push transitions forward. In some cases, this applies even if it comes at a personal cost, such as the loss of elites' status or leadership roles or positions, as in the case of Malin. Okay, because I see the time, I'm going to summarize a bit of this next ethnographic example as well. Here I'm talking about two other of my interlocutors, Harris and his colleague Nina. And they both worked in an oil supplier company, and were trying to grow what they called grassroots changes. They wanted to bring green technologies into this huge multinational oil company. And Harris, he had been working in oil and gas his entire life. His father was an oil industry leader, as he called him. And but he had a sort of change of heart, as he said, and believed that something needed to change to make the industry more sustainable and to mitigate climate change. And Nina joined him first in her free time, and then later also worked in the project full time, because they eventually, and this extended over the course of even after my field work, because we kept in touch, they managed to establish a subsidiary to this oil company, which was a renewable subsidiary doing work with hydrogen and some other renewable technologies. And by that creation of this subsidiary, which they managed to grow over the course of 2 years, they also enabled 50 former oil and gas employees from the mother company to switch over into renewables. So they managed to open job opportunities for other industry professionals with sort of a similar desire to leave oil. Harris and Malin's professional reorientations were strongly motivated by their energy and climate visions, in which oil and gas no longer had a place. They actively wanted to lead changes in their own professional lives, as well as within the industry at large. In the process of their own career moves, they created new workplaces and opened opportunities for other hydrocarbon professionals to move into renewables. This is one example of the significant number of new job opportunities that were created for people with transferable skills and an interest to work in renewables in Norway throughout 2018 and 20, due to reoriented investor climates and new strategic corporate targets. By moving into the renewables sector, oil levers also encouraged other energy elites to follow suit. As more energy elites become oil levers, I suggest it's likely to animate those energy elites resisting changes to become more receptive to the pursuit of energy transitions. And so I'm summarizing again. The second company where I stayed at was also formerly this huge oil and gas major, but then started incorporating renewables in their portfolios. So they became a mixed energy company. And they had a renewables department, which is where I was based during my fieldwork. And I witnessed almost daily that new employees would come. So almost every day a new person came to work for that part of the company, sometimes even more than one. And some of those people were moved internally from the oil part of the company to the renewables part. Many came externally from oil companies to work in the renewables part, and many were graduates who had a keen interest to work in renewables. And they actually, in the oil part of that company, they had real struggles to attract graduates to work in oil rather than in renewables. So I interviewed one of these people. He had been working for a different oil company and moved into that renewable branch of this big mixed energy company. And he told me, there was an environmental perspective to my choice of course, but I'm not going to pretend like that was the main driver. I spent 11 years in the subsea hydrocarbon industry, saw tremendous technological development, which was very exciting. But that is not going to continue in the next 10 years. Now it's more about doing things more cost effective, et cetera, which is important, but really not that exciting. To go into the renewables field where everything is developing very fast technologically, where there's new solutions coming all the time, that's extremely interesting in itself. It's a field where I can contribute with my knowledge, experience, and really make an impact as well. The environmental perspective is important, but it's also extremely motivating just to see that our work in the offshore wind industry, he was working in wind, is changing things globally. This perspective showed me that the aforementioned changes taking place in and outside of the energy industry in Norway created a particular environment that encouraged energy elites to switch jobs. Following new opportunities and driving innovation was seen as exciting and as such perhaps comparable to what people previously had experienced work in the oil and gas sector to be like. Working in extreme conditions on the frontier of technological challenges used to be part of the sense of the oljeeventyret, oil adventure, my interlocutors associated with the early days of working in the oil and gas sector. Now that the external contexts were changing, including increasing pressure to reduce carbon emissions from vocal publics and sustainability-oriented investors, so too was the outlook for the hydrocarbon sector. Renewables, I suggest, were taking up the former position of hydrocarbons, particularly in terms of the way they were perceived as innovative and frontier. Energy elites became part of energy transitions by realigning their professional identities away from the old glory of oil and gas towards the new and exciting renewables frontier. Leaving oil for most of my interlocutors was, I have to emphasize, this was not a choice that they made lightheartedly, but it was a transition that was made easier by the shifting environment around them that grew so increasingly critical of hydrocarbons. This suggests that energy transitions are more likely to be promoted by energy elites and others if there's a growing infrastructure and environment favorable to energy, renewable energy production. Now, before I conclude, I'll give you one more ethnographic example and my analysis, but again, I'll summarize parts of it. So remember that news article that I showed you the screenshot of, and I said that they were portraying leaving oil as a very linear activity, moving from working in oil for many years to then moving to renewables and working there for many years. The way I experienced some of my interlocutors' career changes was not so linear. Some actually worked in oil, then switched to renewables, and eventually went back into oil. And also, particularly one executive that I met, she was the CEO of one of those big mixed energy companies. She switched almost routinely between leading an oil branch of the company and then leading the renewables branch and then moving to another oil branch. And these moves seem to reflect that company's mixed energy branding, that all parts of the business, even the fossil fuel branch, were involved in the corporate goal of contributing to low carbon energy futures. Such positions, specifically when represented by an executive from a large energy company, provided a sense of security to those remaining in the hydrocarbon business at this time of transitions. It emphasized the interconnectedness of various energy technologies and the anticipation that oil and gas would continue to be an important energy source in the future. As such, it seemed to act as a means to downplay the effects of other oil levers and their exodus from fossil fuels. It also suggests that at least some energy elites were acutely aware that their positions allowed them to promote their desired energy visions. And some of my interlocutors were also convinced that working for a big mixed energy company would have a bigger environmental and strategic impact than for a renewables company, which they already sort of understood as transitioned or doing the right thing. And so was Frederick, another interlocutor of mine. He was first in diplomacy and politics, but then made a career move into a renewables only company. And then a couple of months before we met, he actually switched into EnergyMax, the company I mentioned before, this big mixed energy company producing both oil and gas and also renewable energy. Over coffee in the white marble glass minimalistic cafeteria of his new office building at EnergyMax, he detailed his incentives for moving careers to a company producing both hydrocarbons and renewable energy. He says, "Some people say, you work at EnergyMax, you cannot be serious about the climate. They say, I don't understand why you chose to work there." Frederick shrugged his shoulders, raised his eyebrows, and moved his head side to side to express a sense of exasperation with those types of inquiries. He said, "You know, I came from Rain Power, which is one of the largest producers of renewable energy in Europe. I think I can do more with CO2 emissions working in EnergyMax than I can do in Rain Power. The competence, the creativity, the engineering brains, the will to invest, and the ability to invest is larger in this company than in any other Nordic or at least Norwegian company. But let's face it, the emissions here at EnergyMax are very big. There's still so much more to be done." So Frederick's career orientation is quite different to those of the other people that I introduced to you, because he moved from renewables into a part hydrocarbon producing company, but his professional change was similarly driven by a motivation to push for more sustainable low carbon energy production. And it also sort of suggests, because he thought there was more to be done at EnergyMax, that he saw renewables only producing companies as on the right track or already successfully energy transitioned. And many of my interlocutors felt similarly, because Norway has a 100% decarbonized domestic electricity production. And so energy transition efforts for them focused really on decarbonizing the oil and gas industry, as well as other carbon intensive industries. And that differentiates Norway from other energy transition contexts. But it almost puts it as, Norway as a sort of more advanced, if you will, stage of energy transitions. Despite the apparent and relative advance in energy transitions in Norway, energy elites were confronted with an energy industry and a double bind. The renewable electricity supply allowed for the promise of a continued electrified Norwegian hydrocarbon production and export. Moreover, a long and contested history of renewable energy extraction in Norway, particularly hydropower, meant that many energy elites were also acutely aware of the limitations of renewable energy production, including social, environmental, and technological problems and impacts. Noting often that there is no energy utopia, not even in Norway, the leaders and experts introduced in this chapter saw a continued and pressing need to advance energy transitions, whether in a carbon-intensive field like Frederick or in the renewables sector like other oil levers. The Norwegian energy transition and transitions and energy elites are therefore not just an example of a relatively advanced energy system promoted by a privileged group of people, but of complex, liminal, and conflicting developments towards renewable energy futures that can be found in many, if not most, energy transition contexts. Okay, I'm almost done, just a few words to conclude. This chapter has detailed the shifts in personal perceptions and reasons why energy elites decided to become oil leavers. It demonstrated that energy elites' professional reorientations were driven by career, ethical, sustainability, and technical considerations, and enabled by an industry environment increasingly favorable to low carbon energy production. While oil leaving had started years before, the oil and gas exodus of energy elites and migration towards renewables could flourish in 2019 and 2020 in an industry that saw increased investments in low carbon energy projects, including the creation of jobs in the renewables sector. And in this atmosphere of changes, oil-leaving energy elites, empowered by their career mobility and professional status, became key promoters of energy transitions. In this chapter, I've suggested that, contrary to the dominant arguments in the literature, elites can advance societal changes. While they may choose to do so out of personal interests, ethical, sustainability, technical, or career-related, it is argued here that elites' choices to push for changes have an effect on society overall. Elites can be the figureheads of societal transitions, encouraging others, including non-elites or other elites, to pursue changes. Due to their strategic positions, they also have the ability to create spaces for other people, other industry professionals in societal transitions through, for example, the creation of jobs. The research also demonstrates that personal decisions of elites are shaped by the wider social circles and via larger trends in society. In the case of oil leavers in Norway, their career orientations were influenced by their private and professional networks, as well as the wider socioeconomic context of Norwegian energy transitions. As such, energy elites' moves to renewable energy businesses were encouraged by their surroundings. This in turn suggests that elites' promotion of changes influenced by wider society is likely to be in the interest of at least a part or even a majority of that society. Further research on the topic can provide insights on how non-elites in Norway and elsewhere perceived oil leaving and the promotion of renewables. Future studies could also analyze how elites may encourage or perhaps hinder energy transition in other countries, particularly in places where hydrocarbons are also understood as pillars of socioeconomic life, like Russia or Oman. This research suggests that once some energy elites start promoting energy transitions, others may follow suit. With an increasing number of elites pursuing rather than resisting societal changes, structural shifts can be accelerated. In Norway, oil-leaving energy elites promoted themselves as well as the Norwegian energy industry as future-oriented, sustainable, and climate proactive. This low-carbon, renewables-embracing image to some extent allowed the hydrocarbon sector and those energy elites and professionals who stayed in it or returned to it to continue to thrive. Whilst many oil and gas companies advanced low-carbon initiatives, including the electrification of platforms or carbon capture and storage programs, Norwegian oil and gas production and its emission could continue to flourish. Norwegian oil and gas production and its emission continue to flourish at the time of writing or as we speak. Despite the vocal publics who demand an end to the hydrocarbon sector, despite the growth in renewable energy businesses, and despite the promotion of renewable energy production by energy elites, Norwegian fossil fuels continued to be produced and exported. This suggests that energy transitions can only come into full effect once most people find the move towards renewable energy production and consumption more desirable than their hydrocarbon alternatives. Energy elites can contribute towards energy transition efforts, but there is still a long way ahead to achieve a sustainable, renewable future for everyone. Okay, thank you very much.